Hi everyone, welcome to today's webinar looking at managing workplace disputes. We're just going to wait a couple of seconds while there's a few more people logging on. So just give us 10 or 20 seconds and then we'll get underway. Okay, we might have a few more people join us, but that's fine. We'll get started. So thank you everybody for your time today. Myself and Olivia, who I'll introduce, both work for HR Assured, part of FCB Law. And we're here today to talk about managing workplace disputes and looking at the best practice tips to protect your business with this as well. So today we have myself, I'm going to be presenting the webinar. I'm a business development manager here at HR Assured and work with businesses to ensure compliance across your HR and WHS operations. We also then have the lovely Olivia Perry. So Olivia is a qualified workplace relations consultant at HR Assured. She regularly provides advice to a large range of clients about workplace laws and the management of complex workplace matters as well. So I just wanted to do a little overview for you of who we are as a business. So this is the FCB family. HR Assured is part of FCB. We are a group of companies that provide a range of workplace compliance solutions for businesses, from workplace law and migration services to outsourced HR, human resources software, and ISO certification. So what do we do within the HR Assured team? Ultimately, we help businesses avoid the admin so that they can focus on creating the culture. If you're not too familiar with HR Assured, I'll explain the many benefits of partnering with us. You get access to our award-winning HR and WHS services, which include our 24/7 telephone advisory service, which Olivia works for, a comprehensive HR audit, which is done at the very beginning of our partnership, a fully functioning HRIS software, and then the employment practice liability insurance and representation. There is then, of course, the WHS side of things, as well as a library of resources as well. So look, throughout our webinar today, you will hear us refer to these resources that our clients have access to. And after the webinar, we'll follow up with each of you to see where we might be able to help with your business as well. So with regards to today's agenda, we will be looking at some real life examples of workplace disputes, and then of course, how you can avoid making these mistakes. Please feel free throughout the webinar today to pop any questions that you have into the chat box, and then we'll go through as many as we possibly can at the end. And for those that we don't get to answer today, we will get back to you after the webinar. So for now, I'll pass over to the lovely Olivia to take you through what exactly workplace disputes are.
Thanks, Sarah. So jumping straight into it, we're going to look at what really workplace disputes are. And we've got a little bit of information here from the Snapshot Australian Workplace, just going through essentially that half of all workers that were sort of surveyed within that survey have experienced one or more serious incidences or conflicts within the workplace. Obviously, a lot of those probably won't go to formal complaints, but when they do, we really need to be managing them in the proper manner. We can also see here 41% of respondents noted conflict with a co-worker, a boss, a manager, and a direct report. And then further that, 30% of them rated their workplace environment as quite toxic or either cynical. And in an environment at the moment where the market is quite really heavily employee-based, and you really want to be able to keep really good employees within a workplace, you want to make sure that they feel as though they're comfortable, they're not in a toxic environment, and if there is a grievance or a complaint, that you've got some avenue to be able to help them and really motivate them within their workplace. So you really want to try and help with those disputes as soon as possible and manage them in the proper legal compliant manner as well. And that really will help the business too, because it leads to less absenteeism and will eventually lead to hopefully lower rates of employee turnover also. We are now going to go into a few real life examples throughout this process of different disputes that we've seen. And we certainly get quite a few of them through the telephone advisory line. So we've gone through a lot of those through that piece too. So I just want to note before going into these cases as we go through as well, there are, when going through disputes, they're case by case, and some of them can be quite complex. So I guess that's the avenue when you call the 24/7 advisory line, that's a real advantage to have that there, that each individual case can be managed through our telephone advisory line. And because of the complexities that there are involved, sometimes there'll be different pathways that you can go through with disputes. So making sure that you utilise that telephone advisory service is really an advantage that we've got, because yes, we're going to go through examples, but there really is a case-by-case scenario for each one, and it's best to talk to an expert for these.
Just to jump in there, Olivia, as well, if any of you are experiencing workplace issues, we've popped a QR code on this slide and on another couple moving forward as well. Feel free to give that a scan and it will give you the information in order to call us and speak to Olivia or someone in her team with regards to your issue personally.
Yep, so we're going to look at an example one. So this is really managing a complaint. So the example is that we've got two employees, we'll call them Joe and Aaron, and they've been excluding an employee called Donna. So they've been excluding her out of conversations while she's been in there, and that's really made Donna feel quite not included within the business and feels quite stressed by that. So she's had a conversation with her manager, Simon. Simon's then gone to Joe and Aaron, and pulled them aside separately and stated that they're leaving Donna out and they really need to start being a little bit more inclusive within the workplace. So looking at this scenario, you want to try and look through and see where would I be changing things and where would I be avoiding risks in that. And you might look at it and think it's pretty, pretty easy to manage. You talk to Joe and Aaron, you go through that process, but it isn't always that way. And that's where we're saying it can be quite complex and it's a case-by-case scenario. So now that we're looking at how to avoid the risks. So when going through this process, you really need to look at, firstly, whether a formal complaint has been made. So when we're looking at what went wrong in the previous scenario, the manager Simon going and speaking with Joe and Aaron before having a check-in and before having a formal complaint raised from Donna was really the issue in that manner. So that would be the risk there. And that means essentially a few different things. So there's the legal compliance piece that you've discussed, confidentiality and concerns that Donna has raised with other employees before a formal complaint. There's also a piece that you haven't gone through a formal investigation process through that process with Joe and Aaron also. Further to that, with best practice for HR practices as well, it kind of puts Donna in a bit of an awkward situation to have come to a manager and being confidential with that manager, and then to have that go to Joe and Aaron. So it might make her feel a little bit more uncomfortable in a business she already feels uncomfortable in. But the normal process that you would look at for this would be going through the process of a wellbeing check-in. So with a wellbeing check-in, there's lots of different avenues that you can have that, whether it be informal or formal. And there's lots of different complexities to it as well as advantages. So a wellbeing check-in has lots of advantages that it allows the employee, being Donna, to have a chance to reply to everything, process it all, and it makes her feel as though there's a safe space that if she does want to put through a formal complaint, she feels comfortable doing so and doesn't feel the pressure within the business to be there in an uncomfortable environment. It also allows her to feel very empathetic with the business and as though they've got her back too, so that her manager can really manage it going forward with her and she feels though she can come forward with things. So that kind of goes back to that toxic environment piece where a large percentage of staff feel they're in a toxic environment. So having that support and wellbeing check-in really does help with that process. Going forward, if a formal complaint is put forward from Donna, I'll run through a little bit of a snapshot of the investigation process. So with this investigation process, however, if you are with HR Assured, the process is actually online and documented in quite detail on our HR Assured website and our HR Assured cloud. So there's invitation letters, there's guides to the meeting, and lots of different templates in there as well, which really help through the process. So with a formal investigation meeting, you would have to send through an invite, you would have to give notice of that and offer a support person if need be for that process as well. So you'd send an invitation letter to Joe and Aaron, you'd have individual meetings so they both feel like they can respond to all the allegations. You would allow them to discuss responses, which is another piece of legal compliance, and you would have substantiations from there. So you would then go away from the meeting, have a think about whether the substantiations of them leaving Donna out was concluded or not. And then you would go through managing the dispute. as well as any performance management or warnings if necessary. So that might not be necessary in the scenario, but you can manage that as you go along in terms of the complexity of the scenario and case by case as well. So that's again, linking back to how the telephone advisory line can help, because you'll be able to explain your dispute and we'll be able to go through whether the investigation process is necessary or not, and whether performance management or a warning is necessary also. So just to the next one, we're going to look at managing harassment or discrimination. So it might not be bullying in the case that we have discussed, but I wanted to discuss the bullying definition and what that means, because there might be a scenario where it does come under bullying and harassment. So we've got that definition here as a person or group of people who have repeatedly behaved unreasonably towards another worker or a group of workers. So we have some examples here. Some of them being behaving aggressively, teasing or playing jokes, and then, as you can see as well, excluding someone from work-related events or excluding through those workplace-related incidents. So that would be the case we spoke about with Donna. We can also look at discrimination here, and as you can see, there's quite a detailed list of different attributes which you can be discriminated against. And that's something that you would need to manage and go through disputes if someone does bring forward a discrimination complaint, because the legal ramifications can be quite tenfold, and essentially there'd be a lot of liability on the employer if they weren't managed and the dispute wasn't looked up and the complaint and grievance wasn't investigated. So through that, looking at the risks and what the risks can be for the business, essentially it would fall under what's called a general protections claim risk. And I'll run through that as well. So with a general protections claim risk, it's essentially that an entitlement has been taken away, or a national employment standard has been taken away from the employee in some instance, essentially. So one of those in this case might be the harassment or discrimination. The difficult part with a general protections claim is that they can be uncapped as to how much the Fair Work or a court may fine a company. So with that, it does mean that they can penalise as much or as little as they wish to do so. However, the maximum penalty for unlawful discrimination protections can be 66,000. So it's quite a substantial fine when you're looking at that also. So contravention and having that compliance is really important in that workplace. Other costs to the business as well in terms of harassment and discrimination, which can be quite important, are obviously the loss of knowledge and experience within the business. Keeping those people who are quite important to the business is important, and you want to try and avoid that turnover where possible. So having those supports like the wellbeing check-in and also investigating as soon as you feel as though there might be any bullying or harassment or discrimination is really important to the business in that best practice. You also, if there is discrimination in the business, you're limiting diversity and the benefits to the workplace in that capacity. And you also don't want to have that loss of productivity within the workplace as well. Further to that, you also have workplace health and safety standards and a duty of care to your employees too. So managing those standards and that compliance is also quite important to this piece. So as we're sort of discussing with that performance management and those warnings pieces, if an employee has been bullying or harassing or discriminating against another employee, it can be quite serious, and some of those may lead to a warning or even serious misconduct and potentially termination if need be. So I guess, again, best to speak to an expert when going through these processes, because a warning or a termination may not be appropriate, but in some circumstances it certainly may be. So it needs to be managed immediately as liability does fall on the employer. So just keeping that in mind as well. But essentially with warnings, again, going through the HRA cloud, there's heaps of templates and there's heaps of processes that you can go through in terms of mapping all of that. So it's quite important when you're going through that you're looking at documenting formally and having those discussions formally, because that does link to legal compliance. And you want to make sure that when you are terminating as well, that there's that legal compliance to it, because there may be eligibility for, again, general protections claims, but also unfair dismissal. So we're going to move on to our second example here. So we've got essentially gossip going around the business. And it's a bit of a rumor that Tim and Helen are in a relationship. So again, we've got manager Simon, who pulls Tim and Helen aside. So it lets them know that there's gossip going around about their relationship, and just suggests that they keep it a little bit more secretive because everyone's talking about it, and just sort of keep the gossip down to keep the relationship under wraps. Following that, Helen gets quite upset by that. She's very disgruntled, denies being in a relationship with Tim, and after 10 years of employment with the company, she decides to resign. The company then accepts her resignation, pays out all of her entitlements, and they move forward with that resignation. So with this one, have a think about what you would have done in that scenario. It can be, again, quite complex, and there's different processes where you might think, yep, it makes sense that the manager's done that. But again, you do really have to go look through the compliance piece and go case by case. So when we're looking at potentially the risks of that one, the main risk would be the fact that that Simon has gone forward to Helen and Tim, and again, openly spoken to them without firstly an investigation process, and I guess looking through where the gossip is coming from. So we're really looking at, I guess, best practice with this one. We have quite upset Helen and potentially Tim in this process without having a further investigation and a really thorough process before assuming that they're in a relationship. So with this one, you wouldn't initially discuss with Helen or Tim. You would discuss if there's any evidence and any processes you can find out where the gossip is coming from, and go through that investigation internally with that process. So it's important that you're not making assumptions in these investigation processes, and you're really looking at, where it's coming from, rather than assuming that the fault is on Tim and Helen in this instance. So we're going to also look at, within this instance, the resignation as well, because there is an element of the heat of the moment resignation. So managing the resignation in the heat of the moment. So when you're looking at a lot of instances where the employee has been quite aggrieved by a situation and has then decided to leave the company because of that, there's an element of what we call resignation in the heat of the moment. So you can see we've got a bit of a definition here where it's essentially an employee who resigns because they're quite angry or upset about a situation, may not have rationally made that decision or felt as though they were supported within the business, so they've decided to resign, and then they've decided to regret it further. So the issue with the scenario we spoke about is that the business immediately accepted the resignation and didn't give the employee an opportunity to rescind their resignation. So in that scenario, the employer should have allowed Helen to consider giving the opportunity to retract their resignation. So give them the opportunity to, again, maybe have a well-being check-in, ask if she can come in and have a chat with them about why she's decided to resign, why she's quite upset, giving her the chance to think it over, have a think about whether she would like to resign or not, and then come back to them with an answer. Further to that, obviously there is the concern that they haven't followed proper processes for the managing dispute, but there would also be risk of unfair dismissal claim because they haven't allowed the employee to have that retractive heat of the moment resignation. So something to think about when they are quite aggrieved. We do have a lot of scenarios as well that come through the line of maybe a manager and an employee having a bit of an argument within the shop floor, something like that. Within that moment of the argument, they say, no, I don't want to work here anymore, I resign. They accept that resignation and then move on. So in that scenario, that's where you would look at it again, look at the heat of the moment, give them some chance to have some time away from work potentially, and then see if they still decide to resign. So moving down, we've got example 3. So we've got manager Simon again. He's asked his junior colleague Kelly over a Teams chat to urgently move her jobs around and focus on a more sales system task list that she has. Kelly then speaks to Simon, says she's a bit stressed, her workload's a bit too much at the moment, there's a lot going on in the business, and messages Simon, saying that there's a lot of stress and she's a bit concerned about the sales process that's adding to that. Simon then replies saying, yep, we'll handle that and we won't worry about your stress for now. We'll handle all of that once the sales replies have all been done. Kelly then decides to go to her general manager, letting them know that she'll be heading home. She's way too overwhelmed. The stress and workload's really getting to her, and she'll be unable to work for the remainder of the day. So looking at this one, there's a few things there. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about working from home and managing disputes over working from home as well, because it's quite a big thing at the moment with a lot of companies obviously working from home following COVID. Again, another one where we're going to have a wellbeing check-in with this one. So with this, as soon as Simon Matt heard that the employee was quite stressed by her workload and feeling really overwhelmed, you should definitely try and have a call if you're over Teams, just because sometimes it can be quite misconstrued over Teams, and having that conversation over phone might be a little bit more better of an option, that he can work through her workload and make her feel like she's having that empathetic side of her management as well. So having a wellbeing check-in, potentially looking at her position description and looking at all of the duties for her day as well would be really important, so that she doesn't feel as though she's overwhelmed, stressed, and we don't really know where that could lead. This could have led to a dispute between her and her manager where it got quite heated, and we're trying to avoid that at this stage as well. However, in saying all of this, there is the element of what's called a reasonable workplace management action. So yes, we can manage her stress load and we can manage her workload, but at the same time, Simon as a manager does have that element of being able to ask for her to be able to do her job and reasonably manage that action. So looking at the way Simon handled it, there were certain complexities of risk in terms of that, because of the way it was handled, that we didn't look at the stress, we didn't manage how she was feeling, but at the same time, it's also completely fine for Simon to be managing her and asking her to do certain tasks within her position description. So making sure that there's those two elements essentially to it there. So we're going to look now at managing disputes. So just a few tips and tricks in terms of how to manage the consultation and cooperation within the workplace. So I'm going to look at a few different tips and tricks in terms of when you're in the meeting, when there's maybe two employees who aren't getting along, or maybe a manager and the employee not getting along, and those sort of situations. So first and foremost, we need to make sure we understand the nature of the conflict. With that, you want to make sure you're investigating, as we've sort of spoken about, and make sure you're across the conflict before going into it all. So you may have to get both sides of the stories if there is a formal complaint, having responses from all of the parties essentially, and understanding the full complexities to it. We then move into encouraging employees to manage and conflict resolute. Again, case by case, depending on how serious the nature of the complaint is, but encouraging them to come to some sort of middle ground is a really good mediation tool as well. So sort of having that management is really helpful to if it is a bit of more of a misunderstanding potentially between two employees. Further to that mediation piece as well, linking back to some of the services that we do provide, we do have a lot of really great advantages to mediation, and we do have a few really great employees within HR Assured and our law team which look after mediations. So if it gets to a stage where we do need a mediation or an investigator or something within there that's sort of outside of scope and you prefer an expert within that area come through, we've got a lot of people that will be able to assist in that management. Looking down the list, we're going to have management of that conflict as soon as possible. Always helps. It means everything's front of mind. If you do need witnesses, it just means that people feel like you're on top of it as well. Further down, listening to both sides, use of neutral language. You don't want to make sure that there's no bias, that you're not sitting in there and one of the employees feels like you're really looking after the other employee a lot more. You want to make sure you're sort of in that middle and that mediator stage where you're conflict resolution and not having that bias. Linking back to, there's a part of finding the cause of the tension, kind of linking back to understanding the nature of the conflict a bit there. And then we're going to go through teaching how to communicate effectively. So in that, you kind of want to make sure that you're accepting your conflict, you're listening actively, being a real calming agent within this process is really important. Sometimes it may be a process where you're just sitting there and listening, and that's okay. Or it may need to be that you intervene at some points where you feel as though the conversation's maybe going in a negative plan, I guess, or negative objective. Listening actively and feeling as though the parties feel as though you're involved and you're listening and you're empathizing with all sides is really important. And analyzing the conflict. So a few questions you might want to ask in terms of analyzing the conflict is, potentially what's the best outcome here? So you might want to put the conflict and the resolution towards the parties. So you might want to say, what is your best outcome? Where do you see this going? How can we support you? So putting it on them in terms of focusing on the future as well. There also might be an element of agreeing to disagree. We may just need to support the parties in terms of moving forward and agreeing to disagree, because there's always going to be conflict in workplaces, and sometimes we're not always going to come to that middle ground, and that's okay. And accepting that's just a part of the process as well. So going forward, again, leading by example, I think it's really important that management, potentially exec team, really filter down and lead by example. So making sure that there's compromise, there's a good environment, and making sure that everyone feels really supported through the process is really the main thing through all this. So linking back to a few of the concerns that we've had, if there is a process where there needs to be a performance management or disciplinary process, managing that following the investigation is really important. Again, linking back to our cloud that we have, there's a full process in terms of performance improvement plans and disciplinary process for warnings as well, in terms of templates, guidance, all those sort of pieces within the cloud. And they do go step by step, which is great. So you can follow along with that process too. Further to that, if you do need to performance manage, again, chatting to an expert like our telephone advisory line is a really great avenue, because there might be complexities to it that we can guide you through in terms of the conversation as well. But essentially these performance managers, you want to make sure that the employees have a chance to fully respond to the allegations and issues, and then there's predetermined outcomes that aren't bringing to the meeting. There's no bias, and you're prepared for that performance management. When you're in that meeting as well, having reasonable expectations for it as well. So making sure that you're not setting unreasonable guidelines or unreasonable expectations on the employees in terms of moving forward and how they feel they need to be supported is really important. But again, case by case situations sometimes with these ones. So I'm just going to link back on general protections. So I have sort of discussed it a couple of times. Again, available to all employees. So that would be casuals as well in these situations, in comparison to unfair dismissal, where casuals won't have that eligibility. In terms of general protections, kind of touched on it, but essentially it's that employees cannot be treated adversely for exercising a workplace right. So linking back to those entitlements, and they're protected through these general protections. These damages are also uncapped, as I mentioned, and the employer then has to show that they haven't undertaken the action for a discriminatory reason. So a good example I like to use with these general protections are potentially if an employee has had quite a lot of sick leave, maybe, and the employer decides to terminate on the basis of that sick leave. So with that sick leave termination, you would then have to prove that you didn't terminate on the basis of sick leave, which is quite a big burden for the employer to take on. So looking at that, you'd need to make sure that there's an element of that not being concluded that you were terminating on sick leave. So that's a good example I like to use with that one. There's obviously quite a lot of other general protections and entitlements. So that, again, quite complex. So sometimes good to run through as much of the scenario as you can when you're on the line to the telephone advisory line, because we can really look out for those flags of general protections in that process as well.
Lovely. Thank you very much, Olivia. Please feel free to grab some water before the questions. So just before we go to your questions, as I mentioned earlier, I wanted to offer participants the opportunity to book in with a free health check valued at $750. It's safe to say that conducting these regular checks on your business's workplace practices is one of the best ways to avoid any compliance issues. Think wage theft and general protection claims. Unfortunately, these matters can be costly and can negatively impact on your business's reputation. So have a think about when was the last time you did a compliance audit, and should one be done soon? If compliance has been on your mind, don't put it off. Scan the code for us now. Claim your free 30-minute health check at $750, and we have 20 of these available. Just to reiterate our services again, in order to avoid the admin and avoid the claims that we have spoken about in today's session, as mentioned, we do offer all of the resources and tools in order to help you run your business with peace of mind. After the initial HR audit, where you end up with a compliant documentation suite, you then of course have access to the likes of Olivia and the rest of the team 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and those guys are always on hand to check those HR and WHS questions. It may be, am I paying someone under the correct award? Or as Olivia spoke about earlier, it could be some of those more complex issues as well, where they will talk you through different options in order to mitigate risk. Couple this with the fully functioning human resources information system and the employment practice liability insurance. Everything we offer is designed to support your company to run compliantly, more efficiently, and to give you time back to work on some of the fun stuff. All right, now we've had lots of questions come through, so let's jump into some of these questions now. As I mentioned, if we don't get through them all now, we will be replying to every single one that's come through individually. Okay, so the first question we have here, Olivia, my worker has walked off site due to a dispute with their manager and has said, if refusing to finish work, so I sent him home. I assume this is his resignation. Do I need to pay him for the hours he didn't work?
Yeah, so again, sort of looking back at that heat of the resignation moment one, so we're kind of looking at, you know, is the resignation true? We would need to ask if he would like to rescind that resignation. So all that sort of part, first and foremost, but looking at the hours, and when you're going through payroll for that one, with the hours, you would need to look at the minimum employment standards of the compliance piece for that. So it's a little bit confusing because you would need to make sure that there's the different award compliance of the minimum employment standards. Sometimes that's 3 hours compared with certain awards. Sometimes that's 2 hours with certain awards. So again, something that you might need to call us for with that part. Further to that as well, there may be elements of putting them on sick leave if they are a permanent employee, part-time or full-time, in comparison to being a casual who wouldn't have access to that sick leave if necessary. So really looking at, again, first and foremost, minimum compliance standards, how many hours have they done? Sick leave, are they eligible for sick leave? If yes, go through that process of getting agreement for sick leave. Alternatively, you would just need to pay the minimum employment standards of those hours for compliance.
Lovely, thanks you, Olivia. Okay, the second question we have here, an employee and their manager don't get along, and the employee is asking for a change in reporting line. What should I do?
This one's a very difficult one because sometimes in small businesses, it can be extremely difficult to swap reporting lines in comparison to maybe a bigger business where it can be quite easy. So you need to sort of look at that balance first and foremost. Is there an opportunity for this employee to change? Is there maybe 5 team leaders that you could maybe filter them through so there is a change in reporting line? If there isn't, then there's the option of then looking back at that reasonable business standards option. Yes, you can support. Yes, you can have wellbeing check-ins. You can go through all those processes of making sure you're feeling really empathetic to the employee and managing if there is potentially, bullying and harassment, discrimination, or if there's anything going through in terms of concerns between the manager of the employee. However, if it's just a case of they're not quite getting along, you would need to maybe go through a potential mediation or having some sort of discussion with the two where they can come to a middle ground, because yes, they can have a complaint and a grievance. You've also got that reasonable business standard that you can enforce within them, that they do have to discuss with their reporting line and go through that process. But something you might want to implement at the start of that would be, as we discussed, the wellbeing check-ins, maybe having a different reporting line for a little bit of time, and also maybe performance managing the manager if need be, maybe giving them training on managerial styles and management styles, and going through that process so you're managing both parties within that.
Brilliant, thank you. Now, the next one, I'm sure a lot of us have had. I think we've all had a moment of wondering if we can ever do our jobs while situated in Bali. So question 3 is, I have recently had an employee who is causing a bit of a stir amongst the team as he is refusing to return to the office. He moved quite far away prior to COVID before working from home. However, now doesn't want to do the commute. So what are my options here to avoid any further conflict?
So first and foremost with this one, you kind of need to look at their contract, your position description, and the agreements that you have with this employee. If there was an agreement that the role was completely remote and you'd already had that previous agreement with them, you may need to look into that and your compliance with that. Otherwise, there isn't really entitlements for employees to enforce working completely from home. They obviously can request it, and there's flexibility requests they can make. And coming out of COVID, I'm sure there's a lot of people who are requesting that and really enjoying it. So it might be best practice to allow it in some circumstances if you can. However, there are a lot of duties and positions where, maybe like a receptionist role or, nurses roles, those sort of details that really do need to be in-house. And there isn't an entitlement for employees to be able to work from home if you do require them to be at home. So you just have that discussion. I guess coming to a middle ground with them, you'd want to have that discussion in a nice forum where you're just explaining, yes, we understand you might want to work from home, either allowing that or refusing it on business standards.
Great, thank you, Olivia. We've got time for one more. Just before we jump into it, please know those we haven't got to, we will get back to you on. And there's also, again, the QR code on the screen, which will give you access as to how to contact us with any other questions you have after this seminar as well. So the final question, I often know what the correct outcome is in a dispute internally, but I'm always quite concerned about putting anything in writing and it coming back on me personally. What are my options here?
So liability with all these sort of things can be quite scary. Obviously having it in writing, again, another complexity. First and foremost, obviously really great to use the telephone advisory line. We do assist with verbal advice as well as written advice. So something you might want to look at first and foremost. However, to answer your question, I think quite complex. It can be kind of confusing because it does depend on scenario by scenario. But I guess just making sure that you're sort of being quite brief within your discussions, and even maybe discussing verbally as a preference, whether that be online via Zoom or Teams or within a meeting, can be a preference in these scenarios, so they're not misconstrued via email or Teams Messenger as well. But yeah, again, quite complex because it can be quite difficult to know, I guess, where the liability lies and what risks you might be saying in terms of the communication you're writing. So maybe something to look into with our telephone advisory line.
Great, thank you very much, Olivia. So guys, as we can see, very complicated landscape, but certainly one that HR Assured are here to help you navigate as well. So please do get in touch. We will reach out to each of you off the back of this webinar as well. But other than that, thank you very much for your time, and we look forward to speaking with you all soon.